So today I'm going to tell you about simulations of piecewise deterministic Markov processes. So I will briefly go over the basics of stochastic sampling. How do you sample from random variables? Which is the easy case to sample from pure jump processes, and then I'll move to sampling PDMPs and tell you how it can be done exactly. So first, why do we need to sample from stochastic processes? Why is it interesting to simulate? For plenty of reasons. The first one is simply to see what's happening. You want to see the trajectories to understand the behavior of your process, to maybe run several samples to see, to have a grasp at the variability of your process. Maybe you are interested in the long time behavior or things like that. You want to know where your process moves in the space. So it's interesting in itself to be able to see the trajectories. But it is not all, of course. It may also be interesting to do Monte Carlo simulations to estimate expectations of functionals of your process. So it's important to be able to know what is the mean behavior, for instance, of your process, or any other thing you can get through Monte Carlo simulations. And it is also important because you can use plenty of simulation-based algorithms to do other things than just estimate parameters. For instance, I'll show you in the second part of this talk how you can solve optimal stopping problems with simulation-based algorithms. So it's really an important tool if you want to do really computations with PDMPs or with any process in general. So to refresh your memory, I remind you that you need three things to build a PDMP. You need the deterministic flow that tells you how you move in between the jumps, phi. You need to know when to jump. This is the clock given by the intensity lambda. And then you need to know where to jump, and this is given by the Markov kernel Q. And then you build your trajectories like this. So where are the difficulties in simulating these processes? Let's look at the flow. If you're lucky, you have an analytical solution, so no difficulty. If you don't have any, well, it's an ordinary ODE. You can use your favorite solver to have an approximation of it. So let's say this problem is solved. About the jump kernel. Well, in theory, it can be any Markov kernel, but in practice, for all the examples I've met, it's always very easy. It's an easy kernel. It says maybe you are divided in two, or you just select randomly the mode between in a finite set, so it's sampling from a discrete distribution, or maybe you make a uniform choice on some region of your state space. So usually it's easy. So there's no problem here. So the real problem is, how do you sample from a varying intensity? And that's the problem I'm going to address in this talk. It is, well, I said difficult. It is not straightforward, but there are specific algorithms that can do exact sampling of this kind of distribution, and that's what I'm going to tell you about today. So let's start easy. How do you sample from a simple distribution? The first step is, suppose you can sample from the uniform distribution. So I'm not going to get into details here, but all the softwares have a function that can do samples from the uniform distribution. Usually it's called the rand function for random. It's not really random numbers, it's pseudo-random numbers, but we consider that they are random enough, they are suitable enough to approximate the uniform distribution. So you can sample from the uniform distribution, that's done. From there, how do you go to other distributions? Well, you know a distribution can be characterized by several things. One of them is a cumulative distribution function, which is, as a reminder, if you have a random variable x, its cumulative distribution function is that the probability that x is smaller than t. Okay? And from this function, you can define a generalized inverse that I call the quantile function, or percentile function, it's the same thing, which when the cumulative distribution function is invertible, it is the real inverse, but you know it doesn't have to be invertible, so you can define this sort of inverse. I'll give you some pictures right after. And if you feed a uniform distribution into this quantile function, you get your target distribution. So on paper, you can simulate any distribution like that. Of course, in practice, you need to be able to compute the quantile function. How do you prove these results? Very easy. This quantile function, I tell you, it's a pseudo-inverse. In which sense? First, if you take the cumulative distribution function at t and say it's above some threshold u, it implies that the quantile function at u is smaller than t. Very easy to see. If the cumulative distribution function at t is greater than u, it means that t is in the set from which the quantile function u is the minimum, the infimum. So of course, there are some typos there. T is in this set. The quantile function of u is the infimum of this set, so it's smaller than t. No difficulty here. Conversely, if the quantile function at u is smaller than t, then the cumulative distribution function at t is greater than u. It's a little bit more complicated, but not so much. How do you do it? You know that the quantile function at u is an infimum, so you cannot say directly that it is smaller than f of t, but you can say that there is a sequence decreasing, converging to t, such that f of Sn is greater than u. And remember that a cumulative distribution function is always non-decreasing and height continuous, so you can go, let n go to infinity, and you have your conclusion. Okay, so and really these two things combined together say that the quantile function is some kind of inverse of the cumulative distributive function. So from there, how do you prove that feeding a uniform distribution to the quantile function gives you a random variable distributed with the target f? Very simply, start from f of t. By definition, as u has a uniform distribution, f of t is the probability that u is smaller than f of t. You just use that the cumulative distribution function of the uniform distribution is the identity on 0, 1. Then there is one little trick here that you can go from a large to strict inequality here, because this distribution has a density, so the probability to be just f of t is 0. And once you have this, you use the two inequalities over there to replace. If u is smaller than f, then it means that the quantile function of u is smaller than t. And if the quantile function of u is smaller than t, use the second inequality. You have that, and that again is using the definition of the cumulative distribution function of the uniform distribution, f of t, which means that you have the same thing in the beginning and in the end. Then you have a sequence of equalities instead of a sequence of inequalities, which tell you that the important equality you get from that is this one. You get that the probability of the quantile function at u smaller than t is f of t, which tells you exactly that this random variable is distributed with this cumulative distribution function. So this is, again, on paper, quite easy. From that, you can very simply sample from discrete distributions. The cumulative distribution function of a discrete distribution is like this. You have values, say x1, x2, x3, for instance, with given probabilities. Your function looks like this. Before the first value, it's 0. Then you jump with a gap with probability P1, then you're flat till the next value. Then you jump with a gap with probability P2. Then you jump to the next value, and so on. And if there are only 3 values, here you've reached 1. So this is a cumulative distribution function. How do you compute the Cantal function here? Very simply. You go from the y-axis. Here, you sample your uniform distribution there, and you go back. And for instance, if you fall in this region here, it means you choose x2. So mathematically, it is exactly this formula here. You draw your uniform distribution, and you find out where it falls in between the accumulated probabilities. And if it falls between the sum up to k and the sum up to k plus 1, it means you have to choose xk. So this is really easy. So sampling from discrete distribution, it's simple. Of course, if you use a software that already has a good sampler, you don't need to do this on your own, but it's always good to know how it works. So from that, if you can easily sample from a discrete distribution, you can very easily sample from a discrete Markov chain, because it's just a collection of discrete distributions that are put into a matrix. So how do you sample from a Markov chain? Very easily. You choose your starting point, x0, and then you do a loop up to your time horizon. If you want to simulate capital N steps, you do it capital N times. And what do? You draw the next value with the distribution given by the xn-1 line of your transition matrix. Because recall that the probability Pij in your matrix, entry Pij, is the probability to go from I to j in one step. So all you need to know is where do I start from, and I know exactly the probability to go to any other space, any other state. So that's how we build trajectory for Markov chains. And you have an example here with the on-off signal I told you about yesterday. So it's really easy one because I just need to sample from 2 possible states, 0 or 1. So it's even more simple than the general rule. I just need to know if xn equals 0, then I will change to 1 if my uniform distribution is smaller than p, because I have a probability p to go to 1. And if it's 1, I move to 1 with probability 1 minus q, which means that my uniform distribution is greater than q. So very, very simple. Now, let's go to the next step and enter continuous time. So now I want to sample from pure jump processes. So remember that pure jump processes is just a discrete time Markov chain plus exponential clocks with normal exponential distributions, which means just fixed component, fixed parameter exponential distribution. So all I need to know is to sample from the exponential distribution, which is very easy because it's really the textbook example where you can know, of course, the cumulative distribution function, and you can compute the quantile function fairly easily. It's just minus 1 over the parameter times the logarithm. So it's really easy to sample from an exponential distribution. Okay. And now, The exponential distribution has another interesting property that I sort of used without telling you yesterday, and it's the following. Take several independent random variables, all having exponential distributions with possibly different parameters. And say you want to compute the minimum, which is exactly what happens in a pure jump process, because you have clocks that tell you how to move from, say, state 1 to state 2. You have another clock to move from state 1 to state 3. You have another clock to move from state 1 to state 4, and so on. And you need to know which one is going to ring first. So you are typically computing a minimum of independent exponential distributions. And it has a very, very, very nice property, which is that the distribution of the minimum is, again, an exponential distribution, and its parameter is just the sum of all the parameters. And in addition, if you are selecting the index of your random variables that want the minimum, it is independent from the distribution of the minimum. So it means that if you want to compute the minimum of, say, n exponential distributions, one way is to sample n exponential distribution, take the minimum, see which one won, and it requires n simulations. Or you can sample directly from the minimum, which means an exponential distribution with the parameter the sum, so just one sampling, and one discrete sampling to get the index that wins the minimum. So you just, in two samples, you have exactly the same information. And you know with which probability you get the index I is just the fraction of the parameter of I over the sum of all parameters. So again, the proof is very easy. So I'm going to do the special case with two only random variables, because by induction, if you can do it for two, you can do it for any number. So take x and y with exponential distribution, independent, and you want to compute the distribution of the minimum and the index that wins the minimum. So as usually with exponential distribution, I'm going to use the survival function because it's easy to compute. So I want to know the probability that the minimum is above t and x wants the minimum. Okay? So it just translates into x is greater than t and y is greater than x. Okay? Now I use that x and y are independent and I know their distribution. So this can be written very easily as integrals. And you can see from the formula that you can compute the integral in y, for instance, on its own. It's the blue terms here. You just get the survival function of y at time x. So as you all know, it's exponential to the minus mu x. And then you have something that looks like an exponential distribution, except that you don't have the right constant in front of it. Well, never mind. Put the right function. Okay, if I want, I can add a step here. So I was here. I have the integral from t to infinity of lambda exponential to the minus lambda plus mu x dx. Okay, and I'm lazy. I don't want to do this computation, even though I could. I'm a probabilist, so with my probabilistic glasses, I say, okay, this is easier to compute. So fairly easy. I do that, so that is the same thing. And then I recognize the survival function of the exponential distribution with parameter lambda plus mu, and that's how I get my formula here. And as I have a product of a term that only depends on t and another term, I can know that this is the distribution of the minimum, and this is the probability that x wins the minimum. And I know they are independent. Okay? So from that, how do I sample from a pure jump process? Very easily. Say I want to go until time horizon capital H. So again, I initialize the value of my process. Say at time 0, my value is x0. I need to keep track of the time. So I have a time variable here that I call s. And while should be an s or t here, well, I have t and s. So it's s here. While s is before the horizon, I draw the next jump time. Recall that in a pure jump process, you have a distribution rates matrix. So you have the rates and these parameters here. If I is different of j, lambda ij is the parameter of the exponential clock that puts you from I to j, and in the diagonal, lambda ii is non-positive, and it's minus the sum of all the other ones. Which means that it's exactly the parameter of the minimum of all the other clocks. So if you want to know at what time you are going to leave x, you need to take this parameter. So this is really the minimum of the other ones. So you sample this minimum, and then you need to know where you are going to move. So you need to know which index wants the minimum. So you do it with, you just need to sample from a discrete distribution. We saw how to do it. So you need one exponential sample, one sample from a discrete distribution, and you can move along your time until you have reached the horizon. And then what you basically do is this. You start from time 0 at your initial position. You select your first jump time. You know your process is flat until this jump time. You select randomly the next state, say here, and so on, until you have reached your time horizon. So then again, nothing very difficult. So here I put you the code of the example I showed you yesterday of the birth and rate process. So it's a bit longer because you have more cases to study than just the on-off process. You need to know if the next event is a real jump or if it's the end of your horizon. So it's what you do is, and there is another trick. The first if is, if there is nobody left in my population, there is no more jumps, because my population is extinct, so it stays extinct till the horizon. So I need to be a bit careful about these special cases, but on paper, it's just what I told you before. Okay. And you can see that my random things here I sample from the exponential distribution, and here I sample from the discrete distributions, depending on the birth and death rates. Okay, questions, comments until now? Everybody good? Okay. So let's go on to the next step. Now I want to sample from a PDMP. What is the main difference from the pure jump process is that I'm not going to sample from a constant parameter exponential distributions, but from one that is allowed to have a time or space varying intensity. So how do I do that? First, you should always try to compute the cumulative distribution function, if you can, and see if it has an analytical inverse. If it does, use that. It's the best solution. For instance, take an intensity that is a power of t. You can very easily compute its cumulative distribution function like this. It's an exponential, so it's fairly easy to invert. So you can invert it, again, very easy. you feed it with a uniform distribution. Not here, just a little trick. I should have put 1 minus u, but if u is uniformly distributed on 0, 1, 1 minus u has the same distribution of u. Okay, so it's easy to sample from this intensity, for instance. So you should always try to compute it first, and if it works, no need to go further. Now, what if it doesn't work? Which means, what if either you cannot compute analytically the cumulative distribution function, or you cannot inverse it? Then what we usually do in probability is to use rejection sampling. How does it work? Again, in a few words, say you want to sample from, to make it easy, let's say I have a density. Okay, I want to sample from this density, but I don't have an analytical expression. I don't know how to do it. What do? I choose another distribution that is easy to sample from, and that dominates this one. Of course, they are all probability distributions, so they have the same area under the curve, so this is impossible, so it is up to a constant. So you are going to sample from a bigger, somehow, distribution. So you are going to get samples everywhere. And you need to correct this sampling because it's not the right distribution. So how do you correct it? You will randomly select or reject your proposed sample, which means that typically you have sampled from the orange distribution. Say you have a point here. You are going to see if it is above or below your target density. If it's above, you reject it. If it's below, you keep it. And you do that, you repeat until you have accepted a point. And with exponential distributions, there is a very, very, very nice feature, is that you can always use a fixed parameter exponential distribution to sample from in the beginning. So you can always dominate, well, at least if your intensity is bounded, you can always dominate with an exponential distribution. So you don't need anything different. How does it work? The idea is exactly the same as taking the minimum of two exponential distributions with fixed parameters, except now you have a varying intensity. So I have almost the same result, which means that if I take x and y with intensities that are now time-dependent, lambda and mu, they are independent. I want to compute their minimum. It's again an exponential distribution. Again, its intensity is the sum of the two other intensities. And now the little difference is in here. To select the index that wins the minimization, you need to know which time you sampled. So you need to know the value of t. And then instead of taking the fixed lambda over the sum, you take lambda at time t divided by the sum at time t. So you can do exactly the same, and it's exactly the same proof as before, except it's a bit more complicated to write because now your intensity is time dependent. So starting point is the same. You want to know when the minimum is above t and x has won the minimum. It's again the probability that x is above t and x is smaller than y. So again, you can write it with the density. So remember that the density of a generalized exponential distribution is just the intensity times exponential the integral of the intensity. So you have here the distribution of x, here the distribution of y. Then again, you can see the survival function of y that appears here. So you can compute the blue term very easily. It's just the exponential to the minus the integral of the intensity. And you do exactly the same trick as here, except that now lambda and mu are time dependent, so I cannot put them out of the integral, I have to keep them in. So I do that, and that's how I get only the conditional distribution of I given t equals x. Okay? And it should be a t instead of x. No, it's x here. It's this one, okay? And that's exactly your results over there. So the consequence is exactly the same as for fixed exponentials. If you take more than 2, they are independent. You take the minimum, then it's exponentially distributed with a parameter that is the sum of all your intensities. And the probability to have any index is just the intensity of this index at time t over the sum of all other intensities. Why is it important to sample from this kind of distributions? Here is how you do it. You want to sample from a varying intensity, lambda, and say you know an upper bound, lambda bar, okay? What you do is that you are going to virtually create another random variable, y, with intensity, your maximum, minus your varying intensity, lambda bar minus lambda of t. It's positive, you can always do that. Independent from x, okay? Then, the minimum of x and y, what is it? It's just an exponential distribution with the sum of both intensities, and ta-da, the sum is just lambda bar. It's no more time dependent. So it's easy to sample from. And when are you going to accept this sample? You are going to accept it if x wants the minimizations, which means you are going to accept it with probability lambda of t over lambda bar. So you have your exact sampling scheme for a time varying intensity of an exponential distribution. Okay? So to summarize it, you can build exact samplers of time varying intensity exponential distributions. What you need is a global upper bound for the intensity. On paper, it's a global one. You can also refine it to a more local one if you are fairly sure that you are not going to visit too high or too large range of values, so you can cheat a bit about that. What do you need? You need to sample from one true exponential distribution and one discrete simulation. Alors, I put one, it's a bit of a lie, because you have to repeat it until you accept. So you actually don't know how many samples you are going to need before you get one. But it has good features. We can prove that the algorithm stops with probability 1, which is the least you can expect. But you have an unknown random of rejection, so you don't really need how much computation power you need to do that. And I want to make another comment here. Oh, this picture will do nicely. Okay, I said you take an upper bound of your exponential distributions. You can take a very, very, very large upper bound. Of course, on paper, it works with any upper bound. But if you take a very, very big one, what is going to happen? You are going to reject more often. So you need to be careful in the choice of the upper bound. It shouldn't be too high if you want to be efficient numerically. Okay, so now I have all the basic tools I need to be able to sample from PDMPs. First message is always the same. Now, remember that the jump mechanism is the intensity along the flow. So it's a bit more complicated than just looking at the intensity. You need to look at the intensity along the flow to have your jump distribution. So first thing to do is always to try to compute the intensity along the flow, see if you can have an analytical solution for the cumulative distribution function, and see if you can have an analytical solution to its inverse. If you do, do that. So always try first. So on the examples I showed you yesterday, remember you had the Sizer model for cell division, cell growth and fragmentation. I told you the intensity was, along the flow, the intensity was just alpha times x, and my flow was x exponential to the tau t. So if I combine both, I get an intensity along the flow that is just this formula here. I can compute explicitly the survival function. I can compute its inverse, so it's fairly easy to sample from. Just to sample from, I use this formula. Okay, so no need to do sophisticated things. My second example was still cell growth and fragmentation with this time clocked timer model, which means that you divide when enough time has been spent. So here my intensity was alpha times the time, and the flow for the time components is just linear with speed 1. So the intensity along the flow is like this, alpha u plus t if you start at time u. Again, you can very easily compute the survival function. And recall that in this model, you need to keep track of the time until the last jump. So it means that you always start with u equal to 0, because at each jump, you reset u to 0. So you don't need to inverse it for any value of u. You just need to get u equals 0, which gives you this very easy formula. So then again, you can sample very easily from this. Okay? Then if you can't, what are you going to do? You are going to use the exact sampler that I've showed you before for the exponential distributions. So you are only going to simulate from fixed parameter exponentials with your upper bound, from discrete random variables to select which event is going to happen next, well, usually a discrete distribution. Then again, it's a comment I was making on the Markov kernel. It may be a bit different, but in most examples, it looks like this. You will need on paper, global upper bound of the intensity, or at least global in your normal range of values. It is, again, rejection sampling, but with a trick, which means that you are actually going to keep every simulation, which means that you are going to move forward in time, even though you didn't accept your exponential simulations. So you are never wasting time. You may be doing too many steps and too many stops, especially if you choose a too high upper bound. You are going to try plenty of jumps and say, oh, no, it's not a jump. But you are not wasting any power. You are really moving forward in time at each iteration. So this is what is called the stochastic simulation algorithm, or maybe you've heard of it under the name of Gillespie algorithm. It's exactly the same. Here is how it works. I put you on the example of the Morris-Lecar model. Remember, it's a model for potential along a neuron. My variables of interest are m, which is the discrete proportion of open potassium channels. V is the potential of the neuron. And remember, I have a complicated equation linking the number of open channels and the potential. So I need to choose a point to start my simulation from. So I have a given number of open channels. I have a given value of the potential. Remember, alpha is the potential varying intensity to open a new channel. Beta is the potential varying intensity to close a new channel, so for a single channel. So I can compute an upper bound. Alors, on paper, if you look at the expression I gave you yesterday, you will see it is not bounded, but reasonable values of the potential V say it can be bounded by point minus 25. I choose how long I need to simulate until, so I want to simulate until time horizon h, and I need to know how many channels I have on my neuron, which is a capital N. What do I do? Same steps as the pure jump model, but now I need to keep track of the flow. I first draw my exponential distribution here with fixed parameter. As I have n channels, I need to multiply my upper bound by n. So it is my, here, too high distribution somehow, which means for the exponential that its time is maybe too short. I compute this time. What do I do? Same as before. So I have here computed my first potential jump time. I start from there. First, I move along the flow. It's deterministic. I know nothing is going to happen until this time. Okay? So I go there. Once I'm there, I need to know if I'm going to have a jump or not, and if it is a jump, which kind of jump it is. I actually have three possibilities here. It can be either a channel that opens, which will happen with probability the number of, no, it should be a closed here. Again, there is an interchange in here. If alpha is the probability to open a channel, I need to multiply by the number of closed channels to know how many can open. I divide by lambda bar. And with this probability, I'm going to open one channel. Okay? Conversely, I can compute the probability not to open one channel, but to close one. So it is this sum over here. And then note that this is not one, not necessarily. So there is a third kind of possibility, which is it was not a jump. And this is how time always moves forward. So you have three possibilities. You are going to randomly draw your uniform distribution to decide either it's a jump with a gate opening, or it's a jump with a gate closing, or it's not a jump at all, but you have still moved your process up to this time, even though it's not a jump. And then you go on, you select a second one, and then say it was not a jump here, so you go on along the flow, and so on, and that's how you keep going, even though it's not a real jump. Of course, again, you don't want to do too many steps if you want to have a long-term simulation. So this is how it works, and it can really be adapted to any kind of PDMP like this. And this is how I got this nice simulation. So you have on top the potential, you have in the bottom the number of open channels. So that's what I showed you yesterday. If you have about 100 channels, so you can see it's a bit bumpy. And just for fun, if you have less channels, then you can see all the stochasticity of the model, because here I have several realizations, and you can see you completely lose track of the deterministic model underneath. You can visit any space, any time in the space. So that's how we do it. Okay. I told you about in the beginning that if you don't have an analytical solution to the flow, you should choose your favorite solver. That's what everybody does. But there are almost no theoretical results about it. Of course, you know that if you have a good solver, you will get a very good approximation of your flow. From the deterministic point of view, it's well known. But remember that the flow is fed into the intensity, and it's fed into the jump kernel. So if you have a small error on your flow, you have an error on the intensity. And then you have an error on your jump mechanism, and you have possibly an error on where you jump to. And if you have a very smooth PDMP, you can hope it's not a problem. But imagine you have a PDMP with boundaries like this, and if you start from here, you'll get there, and maybe it will jump you somewhere here. And if you start from a very close location, you might get there and have a completely different behavior. So you have plenty of open questions here. So what happens for a general PDMPs with boundaries if you make approximation of the flow? It's an open question. But that's still what everybody does, because what else can you do? Okay, so I will close this first part with some references for this part and the previous one from yesterday. So main references are the book by Mark Davis that really defines this class of processes and establishes all kinds of nice properties. You can also have a look of the books of Jacobsen and Kokoza that really gives you the basics of PDMPs and their properties and their distributions and so on. If you are interested in statistical inference, I'm going to talk about that this afternoon, but not for PDMPs because it's too difficult. There are still some results. You can have a look at this book here, which is the proceedings of a workshop on statistical inference for PDMPs, and you will see that it is difficult problems, and if you want a general procedure, you need a lot of observations, or you need to do something like example-specific procedures. So I'm not going to get into details there, but you can have a look at this. Questions, comments up to now? Before I take you forward, yes? Yes, you can do switching stochastic differential equations. It exists. It will be different because this one, you won't visit many areas of your state space because you move deterministically, so there is little stochasticity somehow. And maybe you want to study smooth trajectories between jumps. If you're interested in stochastic differential equations, you have more noisy trajectories. So depends what you want to model. If you need to model observation noise, for instance, it may be more interesting to have a stochastic differential equation. But there is a theory of Markov of switching SDEs. It exists. Okay, what I want to do in the last part of this talk is to give you an example of problems you can solve using simulation-based algorithms for PDMPs. So I'm going to take you in the land of stochastic control. So I'm going to tell you very briefly what is a dynamic optimization problem, and I'm going to focus on one very specific problem, which is a change point detection. And I'm going to tell you about how I formulate this problem, how I solve it numerically, and I'll give you an example of simulation study. Okay, so what is a stochastic control problem? Very, very basically. You need to make decisions in a dynamic, random environment. What does it mean? It means you need to act on a time-dependent process to change its dynamics. There are basically two ways to do that. You can do that continually. Say you are using the accelerator pedal in your car, you depress it, more or less, and it's never completely on or never completely off, except if you stop, of course. So you just smooth it and use it continuously. That's what is called continuous control. And then you can do it punctually. You can, at a given time, you can change something. For instance, you can change gear. You're not doing that in all times. At one point, you want to accelerate, you get to the upper gear, for instance. Okay? Why do you do that? You do that because you need to fulfill some objective, which often is modeled by a cost function or a reward function, depending if you want to minimize or maximize. But you have some criterion, you have some objective you want to fulfill. For instance, you want to drive as fast as possible given the maximum authorized speed, or you want to minimize your fuel consumption, or you want to do both at the same time. And all that is in the presence of randomness, otherwise it's not stochastic. What can be randomness in my very simple example? It can be other cars. It can be the route that you don't know. You don't know, say you're following your GPS and you don't know where you are going to turn next. So you need to adapt to your environment. Okay? So what is the mathematical vocabulary in this area? What we are interested in is two things. First is the value function. The value function is the best mean performance you can make. So it is the maximum or minimum, depending on your point of view, over all possible policies that you can choose of the expectation of your criterion. It's always an expectation because you cannot hope to optimize almost surely. Okay? So this value function, what can you hope to prove? You have a lot of literature about that. You can hope to prove that it is regular, for instance, continuous, differentiable, convex. You can want to characterize it as the unique solution of some usually iterative equations. And what I will be interested in today is you may want to actually compute it, or at least an approximation of it numerically. So that's the first point of interest. It's this value function. How good can I do? And more important for application, it's interesting to know how good you can do, but it's better to know how can you reach the maximum performance. And this is what I'm going to call an optimal strategy. Most of the time, an optimal strategy does not exist, so what you can hope to reach is an almost optimal strategy, or an epsilon optimal strategy, to speak mathematically. So this is what we want to catch. So then the usual question is, does it exist? Does it have a structure, a special structure? For instance, does it have some kind of memoryless property? Usually it does. You can want to analyze how it depends on your entry parameters, for instance. And you may want to be able to compute it numerically. That is, again, my point of interest today. So this is a very, very general roadmap to study stochastic control problems. Okay, to motivate this, I'll give you an example from the PhD thesis of Chloé Pazin that was defended 2 years ago. You are interested in a population of HIV patients. What are the possible actions you can choose from? It will be cycle of injection of interleukin. So you need to decide several things, because it is cycles of injection, so you need to decide how many injections are you going to make, because prove that it's better to have several ones in a row than just a single one. So you need to decide if you are going to make 1, 2, 3, or more. You need to decide which dose of interleukin you are going to give, a small dose, a bigger dose. And you need to decide when you are going to give this dose. So you need to decide the dates of injection. So that's the actions you need to decide. What is your objective? Your objective is to somehow maximize the health of the patient, and in HIV, the health can be, what is representative of the health is the level of TCD4 plus lymphocytes in your blood. So you want to minimize the time spent under a critical level. What are the sources of randomness in such a model? There are two. One is that there is a random response to injections. All patients do not respond exactly the same to an injection, and the same patient for several injections doesn't have exactly the same response. So there is a source of randomness here. And in our model, you also have individual variability between patients, which means that every patient will have slightly different parameters. And you need to adapt your decisions to the patients. Okay? So she modeled this with a PDMP. I'm not going to give you the details of the model, but I'll just, to give you a flavor of it, give you a sample trajectory. It's a controlled trajectory, so you have here several realizations. So take, for instance, this one. Here you have the first injection here. Your TCD4 counts rises. It is the aim. You want it to be above the 500 threshold. Okay. So at some point you cannot do more than I can't remember if it's 3 or 4 injections because there is a kind of saturation in your body, so it's not worth making more, it won't go faster. So you stop doing injections, so you have the response of the injection here, and then it goes down. So what you want to do is decide when you are going to make the next injection. So here you have the next series of injection, and you go above the threshold. Great. So you have, again, the fast response, and then it's slowly increasing. And what you want to do is keep above this threshold. So you want to decide when, the natural date to decide when to do your next cycle of injection is just when you reach this threshold. Okay? And then you can maintain trajectories like that. Okay? So more mathematically, this problem falls into the category of impulse control problem. I'm not going to act continuously on my process. I just want to select punctual actions, here my injections, and at a given point I change the dynamics of the process and see how it goes on and on. So I need to select 2 things, intervention dates and the new starting point of the process after the intervention, which is some kind of the type of intervention, things like that, to minimize a given cost. Okay, for instance, I want to repair a component before failure. I want to change treatment before relapse. I want to maintain my TCD4 plus level above a given threshold. I have this objective function. Okay? What is the state of the art of impulse control for PDMPs? There are a lot of works, especially on the theoretical problems. Is the value function regular? Do there exist epsilon optimal policies and things like that? What I'm interested in is numerical approximation, because I want to be able really to compute my things. I want to do it in practice. I want to know when do I put the next injection in my patient. There are much fewer works on this. There is a paper by Costa and Davis in the 80s, which gives a way to approximate numerically the value function and an epsilon optimal strategy, but really it works well for a small class of PDMPs, where you can discretize the state space, and when basically you have some kind of, you know you are going to visit all parts of the state space at all times. Then I worked on this problem with François Dufour and his INRIA team in Bordeaux. We did a lot of things on approximated the value function. And we have heuristics for an epsilon optimal strategy. And then you have the work of Chloe that I've just presented, where she built a numerical approximation, but really based on heuristics because she needed something really working. Okay? In all these cases, there is one very important thing, is that you suppose that you can observe exactly your process at all times. Remember the curves I've just shown you here. I want to act before my level reaches 500. Okay, I just need to wait till it reaches that. But then I don't have a measurement in your blood in real time. So I don't know when it's going to happen. And that is what makes all these nice numerical approximation completely unrealistic, because you always suppose that you see the jump times, whereas in most real applications, the jump times are hidden, because it's not something you see. If it's something that breaks down, you may not see it. If it's a relapse from a disease, you may not see it. You may not have real-time monitoring. So what happens if the jump times are not observed? If you remember yesterday, I told you all the randomness of the PDMP is given by the jump times and the post-jump locations. So having information on the jump times is really, really, really important to be able to do things with your process. So if you don't see the jump time, you have very, very, very strong problems, because it's really horrible to deal with not observed jump times. Whereas in real applications, again, they are most of the time not observed. So up to my knowledge, there are only 2 works that deal with with partial observation, at least, which means that you don't see the process at all times. But in both these papers, you actually see the jump times. You just see the post-jump locations through noise, meaning you have uncertainty about the post-jump locations, but you still suppose that you see the jumps, which is completely, again, very interesting, but not realistic for plenty of applications. So this is the problem I want to address today. What if I don't see the jumps? As it's very, very difficult, I'm going to do a very, very, very much more simple special case. And when I say much more simple, it's really, really, really the simplest case I can imagine. And you are going to see it's still complicated. So I'm going to suppose that my PDMP can have at most one jump. Okay, so very simple. So it's one jump and then that's it. I'm going to suppose that I have a discrete noisy observation of the continuous variable, but I cannot see the mode. So think that the mode is, for instance, you have several possible relapses of a disease. You are type 1, type 2. You don't see it. You just measure some proxy in your blood that can tell you how it moves, but you don't have the information of the mode. The mode is completely hidden. And I'm just seeing the continuous variable. I'm going to suppose that the continuous variable is one-dimensional. And then again, there's only one jump. And what I want to do is just detect this jump. So I want, from the observation of the continuous variable, I want to be able to say, the process has jumped. And if it can jump to several possible values of the mode, I want to estimate the new mode after the jump. I want to be able to do both things. And to do that, I'm going to turn this change point detection problem into an optimal stopping problem. I'll show you how. So my typical example is the following, and we have real data on this, so it's work in progress, so I cannot show you the data, but maybe in a year or two I'll have nice results on real data. We have a population of cancer patients. The possible actions will be, do we change treatment? Say you have two types of treatments, treatment 1 and treatment 2, and you want to decide when you change treatment because you know eventually your cancer is going to grow, and even though it's under control with treatment 1, usually in cancer you have competing population of cancer cells. If you kill one population, the other one is going to explode after some time. So at some point you will need, some kinds of cancer, you will need to change the treatment, and you need to decide when you want to change the treatment. And the objective, of course, is to maximize the lifetime of the patient with minimal secondary effects, so you don't want to give unnecessary treatments, but you don't want to wait too long, because then it's possibly endangering the life of the patient. What are the sources of randomness in this example? In the relapse date, and in the relapse type. I tell you, I'm looking at diseases when you have several types of relapse and you want to detect, again, the date and the type of relapse. What are the observations? That will be the continuous variable of my PDMP. It can be a cancer cell load or any proxies that can be measured, usually through blood. And an important feature is that cancer patients are followed. Depends on the clinical trials, but some say every 3 months. So it means that your observations are not close to one another. You have large gaps between observation, and this is really one feature I want to keep. Because of course, if you had very, very close observation from one another, you almost get the continuous time behavior, and you are going to be able to detect things very easily. But then I really want to be in this framework where I have long gaps between observations. Okay. So how do I turn that into a change point detection problem for PDMPs? My state space is going to be just the real line. I'm one-dimensional. And I have several modes, 0 to D. 0 will be, say, the cancer is not started, and I want to detect when I have a relapse, and the relapse can be either type 1, type 2, type 3, or type D. Typically, D equals 2. Why do I have other variables here? Because I told you I want one-dimensional process, but you can see R times R. Because I want the distribution of the relapse to be time-dependent. I could have chosen a model where it is state-dependent, but you are going to see why I don't do that. So I need to use the time-augmented process, like I told you yesterday. So I'm going to use that, and I need these extra variables to keep the Markov property. So the last variable here is just the time. Okay? So I start at mode 0, which will be the nominal mode, with a flow of I0. And I told you there is just one jump. So this jump will happen within time-dependent intensity. And after this jump, I'm going to switch to another flow, either phi1, phi2, phi3, etc. And I will switch to mode I with probability pi. So very simple model. And then no more jumps. So I cannot do much more simple than that. Okay? Now, what are my observations? So I don't see the process in continuous time. I have observation times Tn that are regularly spaced. So you have on the x-axis, you have my observation time, T0, T1, T2, etc. And at these observation times, I don't see the actual position of the process. I see it through noise, which means I see the real position plus, say, a normally distributed noise with small variance. And it can be exactly the observation, or it can be a function of my real value here. So I have only observation at discrete times, and these observations are noisy. Okay? And from the y's here, what do I want to do? I want to detect the unknown time t here. Okay? And I want to detect the slope after the jump, so I want to know if I follow this trajectory or that one. Okay? That's my aim. How difficult is it? I'll give you some simulation examples. Say d equals 3, and I'm taking a very simple flat then exponential model. What do I mean by that? I mean by if I am in mode 0, I'm just flat. There is no flow. I just keep at 0. I start from 0, I keep, it's 1 here. I start from 1, I keep the value 1. And then I have 3 possibilities. Either I will jump to a very, very slow exponential with parameter 0.1, or with a sharper one here with parameter 0.5, or with an even sharper one with parameter 1. So you see the slopes are fairly different. So here the red dots are the observations, and what you can see from left to right is the level of noise that increases. Of course, if you have very, very little noise, like here, you are going to be able to detect, especially if you have very different slopes before and after. Here, with the naked eye, you can see where the change is. If you have more noise, well, take this one. Can you tell me, imagine you don't have the blue curve, you just have the red crosses. Can you guess where the change is? It's much more difficult. Okay? Of course, it's not a new problem, and there are plenty of ways in the literature to address it. I mean, at least to address similar problems. The first class of similar problems to this is what is called segmentation. What is the aim of segmentation? Is that you have collected all the data until your time horizon, and you want to detect a posteriori where is the change. Okay? So for instance, say you have all the, I don't know, there is a famous data set of the levels of the Nile River, and you have it along many, many years, and you want to detect when it was above its normal level and when it was not. Okay? So you can do that a posteriori. Nice. So there are ways to do this, and if you do this, for instance, on this sample, you, do I have it? No. The change is at time 1 here. You have my crosses as the observations, and I'll show you in the next slide where does segmentation say the change occurred. So a posteriori, it's very easy to do. Very easy. Well, it depends on your observation, but you can basically what you do is you try all the possible times for the change, and you select the best one. So it's numerically intensive, but it's absolutely impossible in our medical context because you don't want to wait till the death of the patient to say, oh, I should have changed his treatment there. Okay? Of course, you want to do that in real time. So you want to detect the change as soon as possible, and it's really in my example, the as soon as possible it's not just for fun. It's really important to be able to do this as soon as possible. So all the segmentation literature I don't want because I want to do online decisions. Okay? Then next thing you can do is what is called a moving average method, which is very nice because it is model-free. What you do is that you compute the average of your data in a moving window. And you want to detect when this average change. Of course, you need to select the right window size. And you need to select the right threshold to say it's above the normal level. It will work well if, for instance, your data have a zero mean before the change and say a positive mean after the change, because you are computing really some moving mean. It will be very efficient, of course, if your data have low variance, of course, because you are going to detect, because you can approximate better the mean with few samples if you have a small variance. And of course, it's better if you have a small time interval between data. So for this reason, it's not going to work well in my example. And usually, it's a method that is well understood where your data are independent and identically distributed before and after the change, which is, of course, not the case for a PDMP. But it's still something you can do. Third method you can do is called Kalman filtering, which is you are going to estimate the probability given the data that you have changed, and you can at the same time, and it is the only procedure among the three that I show you that can detect the mode after the jump, you are going to compute a posteriori probabilities to be in any state at any time. And you have a way to do that, which is very nice if your model is linear with a Gaussian noise. So it's really small class of problems. And it works well if you have small time intervals between data. If you have long time intervals between data, it will not work well at all. So you still have here the same data set as before, and you can compute in colors. You have the probability to be in any mode at any chosen time, and you can see in the beginning, of course, you have a high probability to be in mode 0 because you know that's where you start from. And as you go forward in time, you update your probabilities to be in any of the three modes. So here, for instance, if you want to be absolutely sure of the mode after the jump, you are going to wait a long time before you can discriminate between the red and yellow curves, for instance. But remember, I want to detect the change as soon as possible and be able to detect the new mode after the jump, so I want to do both. And then again, I have some kind of threshold management to do, which is not that straightforward, even though I have a Gaussian linear model. And if I don't have a Gaussian linear model, this won't work. So there is no generic method available. If I'm in the context that I'm really interested in, I have a long interval between two observations. I have a non-Gaussian linear model. I have, for instance, a noise that is not additive. And my aim is to detect, at the same time, the change point and the new mode after the change. Okay? So what is my model for that? Okay, I have a finite horizon, which will be a multiple of the observation gap. I need to decide when to stop. When to stop, I need to decide when I have seen the change. Okay, so this is basically a stopping time. And what information can I use? I can only use the information from my observations. I cannot use the information from the real process because I don't see it. So that's what I mean here. I mean that my stopping time must use only the available observations. What are the decisions I can make? The decision is I'm still at mode 0, which means I haven't seen the change, or I am in mode 1, 2, until D. I need to define a cost function that will tell me how good my procedure is. So remember, I want to minimize my cost. So I said that my cost will be 0 if I haven't stopped and I have rightfully not stopped. It will be some component beta times my time gap if I had stopped, I have changed, but I haven't stopped yet, which means some kind of lateness penalty. And I'm going to accumulate these penalties at each jump time. So the later I will be to detect the change, the more it's going to cost me here. And you have, so that is the cost per stage, and you have a terminal cost at stopping. That will be, when I stop, what happens? Well, if I stopped, if I didn't stop until I reached the horizon because I said, okay, at the end of my experiment I haven't seen any change, then it's just exactly the same function as here. I have early stopping penalty. I don't want to stop too early. Of course, it costs 0 if I have stopped at the right time with the right decision. And there is a wrong mode penalty. I have stopped at the right time, but I chose the wrong mode after the jump, so I have all kind of I have a reasonable cost function. If I do the best I can, it should be 0. So I have my benchmark. If I can, I should try to reach 0. Otherwise, I accumulate of kind of penalties. Penalties for being too late, penalties for being too early, and penalties for choosing wrongly. Of course, depending on the weight I put to these 3 parameters, I will end up with very different decisions. Okay? So what is the cost of my stopping time? It will simply be the accumulated cost at each stage plus the terminal cost when I stop. And this is what I call the cost of strategy pi. And of course, it's always, as I told you before, the expectation of the cost. And it depends on the starting point of my process. Okay? Now, this problem falls into the category of partially observed optimal stopping problem, because I don't see the variable x, I just see the observations y. So for instance, I cannot even compute my cost on a real trajectory because I cannot compute, I do not see x. So there is a fairly common procedure in the literature to avoid this. I'm going to turn this partially observed problem into a fully observed one. By doing what? By doing exactly the same trick as the Kalman filter. I'm going to compute the probability given the data that I am in such and such a position. And it means that on the one hand, it's nice because I now have a fully observed problem. But on the other hand, I'm now in infinite dimension. Remember, my x was just one-dimensional. Now I have a probability to be at any value, so I jump to infinite dimension. So it's better, but it's worse, especially from the numerical point of view. So I introduce this filter processes with just the a posteriori probability to see that my process is in this area of the state space, given the observations up to time n. Okay? Now, if I take the filter and the observations, it's a time inhomogeneous Markov chains with explicit transition kernels that I can compute. The cost function for this problem are just the integrals of the previous one against the probability to be in a given state. Okay? And then I have the cost of my strategy here is the same thing, except that I replaced the unobserved quantity x by its integral against the probability, the filter probability. Okay. Now it is the problem I need to solve. Well, what I want to do is to get a numerical approximation of the value function, and I want a computable strategy, hopefully close to optimality. What are the difficulties? The difficulties is, as I've told you before, that the filter is now in infinite dimension. And worse, I can derive recursive equations for the filter, but I cannot simulate it. So even though I could use simulation-based procedure, I cannot even simulate my filter. So I need to approximate it. And that's what I'm going to do here. Okay. I told you in the beginning that one of the nice properties we want to get for the value function, which is the minimum of all the possible costs over all the possible strategies, so over all the possible stopping times and decisions here, you want to be able to characterize it as the unique solution of some equation. And this is well-known results, usually called dynamic programming equations. You know that your value function is a solution to an equation like this, where what do you do? Basically, it's based on this Markov property, on the memoryless property. It means that if you can do the best you can on one step, then you iterate that, and you can do the best possible on your horizon. So basically, it means that at each time step, you need to choose the minimum over all possible actions, which means I believe that I have changed mode, and I try all of them. So if I stop here, I will pay the terminal cost for action A, so I will pay this, or I will go to the next stage, and go to the next stage, it means that I will multiply the value function by the Markov kernel of my process, theta y, that I can, don't give you the expression, but it has an awful analytical expression. So the aim is to approximate this. So as I told you, I cannot simulate theta, which means that I cannot simulate from my kernel R. So I need to discretize these kernels to be able to discretize the dynamic programming operators, and it is then that I'm using some simulation-based discretization grids, so that's what I wanted to show you today mostly. But I cannot simulate theta. So I need to have two levels of approximation. One level will enable me to simulate an approximation of theta, and once I have a simulatable approximation of theta, I can simulate the theta and the y. So here's what it looks like. So here P is the kernel of the true Markov chain Xn, and you see you have this awful expression. It is I can tell you what is this H here, but it's again, it's awful, and you cannot simulate from it, so it's not very interesting. Okay. So how do I do this two-step discretization? First, I start from my continuous time PDMP XT. Okay. Remember that I have only finite observation at given times. So this gives me a Markov chain, Xn, that I still don't see. And then I have the observation with the noise. So that's what we've done. And then I don't see X, so I replace it by an a posteriori approximation given the data up to time n. So this is my filtering procedure. Okay. And I know the dynamic programming equations for this Markov chain. Okay, this is what I've showed you until now. But I cannot approximate this one because I cannot simulate theta. So I'm going to start up in my tree, above there. Where do I need to start to be able to simulate theta? I need to start from my continuous state space Markov chain Xn up there and replace it by a discrete state space Markov chain. I'm going to tell you how I do that in a moment. Then from there, so I replace my true X that I don't see by an X bar. I can feed the X bar through the observation function F and keep the noise and have some kind of virtual observations, Y bar. Then everything is discrete here, so I can define the filtering process for this discrete state space Markov chain, and this one I will be able to simulate. And then I can write an approximation of the dynamic programming equations given this discrete filter. And then I have a discrete filter and continuous state space observation, so I need one more level of approximation to have a fully discrete problem. I will start from this one and get another step to have fully discrete state space, and then an approximation of the value function from this problem. And the nice thing is that I can keep track of the error along all these arrows. So I can know exactly how far I go from the real one, which is this one, to this one. Okay. I'm going to skip this. So how do I do this simulation-based algorithm? I don't want to have some kind of Cartesian grid over my state space, because there is no reason why my process should be stationary or close to stationary. There is no reason why it should always visit the same parts of the state space. So what I want to do instead is I want to put more points where I know I have higher probability to see realizations of my random variables. So to do this, I use what is called optimal quantization, which is a simulation-based algorithm where you just draw points from your distribution. Okay, so you start from any grid you want, simulate points. If you want an approximation with, say, 10 points, you sample 10 points from the distributions, and then you are going to optimize these points. How? You are going to sample a new point. You select its closest neighbor in your current grid, so it is the one in the middle here, and you're going to move it toward your new observation given a stochastic gradient. And you do that sufficiently enough, and you get something like that for a standard Gaussian distribution in dimension 2. So you can see that you have plenty of points in the middle where you have a high density, and no points all around where you know that you have a very small probability to get there. So the nice thing about this quantization procedure, two things. First, you only need to be able to sample from your distributions. You don't need to have not much theoretical properties of it. So if you can sample from it, you can do it. The constructions, the grids can be constructed automatically from the sampling. You know that it minimizes some kind of LP error, which means that if you want to compute the expectation from some functional of your original distribution and compare it to the same functional of your quantized approximation, you can get error bounds for these kind of things. And you have a theoretical constant in this error bound that is usually impossible to compute, but you can always have Monte Carlo simulation to measure your real error. So it's really something you can keep track of the error you're doing. This has a price, of course. You update points one by one, so it is very slow. You need, if you want a very precise grid, you need a long computation time, especially if you are in a moderate dimension. This won't work at all above, say, dimension 10, because you have this curse of dimensionality. And there are plenty of open questions concerning the convergence of the algorithms if your distribution is not very regular, but it's not much of a problem because you can always evaluate your error empirically, so that's nice. So under some technical assumptions I'm not going to give you, we are using the procedure I showed you and using quantizations of my processes, we are able to prove that we have convergence of the approximate value functions, and convergence at which cost? First, the first approximations when you discretize your state space is in basically the number of points in your discretized grid for X, the original process. And then, what is really, really ugly is that if you want n points in the discretization of your theta and y, you will get the power here with the number of points in the previous grid, which means that it cannot work. You cannot get a too precise approximation here because it will be absolutely very ugly there. So you need to keep few points. But remember that PDMPs are very rigid processes, which means that there is not that much variance because there is only the jump mechanisms that give you variance. So this has a possibility, this has a chance to work. This wouldn't work with diffusion, for instance, because you wouldn't catch enough variability, but it works with PDMPs. And do I have time for this? I'm not sure. There, it's time. So I'll just show you. So that's what I showed you before. So this is the same. And on this sample, we will choose to stop here. What can I show you? I'll show you a fun one, which is completely unrealistic, but just to show you we can go further than any of the other methods I showed you. Something that moving average cannot do, Kalman filter cannot do, and that segmentation cannot do. Suppose your flow is a sine, and you change the frequency of the sine. So, of course, if you see here the real continuous time process, you can see that it has a higher frequency after the jump. But remember, you only see the blue crosses. So just to show you, there. Can you see the change? Well, we can detect it with this procedure. And I'm going to stop that. So we have built a change point detection method for a continuous time jump dynamics, able to detect a jump and select the post-jump mode. For general flows, but in one dimension and with one jump. And it's a work in progress, I forgot to mention, with my colleague Alice Clennan from CNRS in Montpellier. And what we want to do is really go to the next step, because what I showed you is really the easiest part, when you just stop, which means you do not control the trajectory. You just want to stop, which means you just want to observe your trajectory. You don't interact with its dynamics. The next step is really to take several decisions and really say, I want to put this or that treatment, and it will change the following dynamics. So it is more intricate, but that's where we want to get. We have real data from clinical trial on cancer, and we are working on it, and we hope to have nice results on that. And go to impulse control and really optimally decide. And the next challenge, once we have done that, which will probably take several years, is a very interesting challenge, is in what I told you, the observation dates are regularly spaced. But in a medical application, what really want to see, when you see your doctor, she or he will tell you, you need to come next in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. So an interesting feature would be to add inside the decision variable when will be the next observations. But then it will be even more complicated, but we hope to address this problem in the future. Okay, and you have some of the references I mentioned here. Thank you for your attention.